This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 26. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from FertilityFriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. If you've been enjoying the show, I would love it if you would take a moment and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It's so helpful to help the show move up in rankings and also to help more people to find the show. And if you're enjoying today's episode, please stop by the show notes page and leave a comment. You'll find all the podcast episodes at fertilityfriday.com/podcast. And you can also find me on Twitter at Fertile Friday. And I've recently created the Fertility Friday Facebook group. So just go to fertilityfriday.com/community and you will be redirected to the group. Basically, the group is in the initial phases, but I hope that with time we will be able to build a thriving and supportive community of like-minded women that will help each other in understanding and gaining confidence using the fertility awareness method. So just head over fertilityfriday.com/community and make a request to join, which will go to me and I'll approve you. So it's Wednesday. What the heck? I always release episodes on Friday. Well, today's episode is the first part of a two-part series on the impact that sexual assault and sexual abuse can have on fertility. And since this is a two-part series, I wanted to release both episodes during the same week. So this is kind of like a bonus episode. But not to worry, I'll be sticking to my usual weekly Fertility Friday podcast. And every now and then I might throw in an additional Wednesday podcast as kind of like a bonus. So part 2 will be released this Friday. So today's guest is a good friend of mine. Her name is Erin Martin. Erin and I go way back. Erin has an extensive history working in the field of sexual assault education and counseling. And Erin and I actually worked together for a year when we both worked for the public education department of the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton. And so during our work together, we would go into the community, high schools, junior high schools, community organizations, and even the Edmonton Police Service to provide education and awareness about sexualized violence, sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and many other topics. So today's episode is all about providing information. We'll be defining exactly what sexual assault and abuse is and talking about some of the most common misconceptions that I can barely believe are still a thing in 2015. So we're basically laying the foundation so that we can all be on the same page when it comes to what types of behaviors and actions actually fall under the definition of sexual assault. So keep in mind that we live in Canada, Erin and I, and so the statistics that we're using and the laws that we're talking about are Canadian laws. So it's not to say this episode couldn't be relevant to you no matter where you live in the world, but just keep in mind that the laws might be a bit different. This is not going to be a disclosure episode, so we'll not be going through any survivor stories. It's not that type of episode, but what we will be doing is having a detailed conversation about, what this is, how prevalent it is, and what some of the common misconceptions are. And some of you might be wondering, what the heck does sexual abuse and sexual assault have to do with fertility? What does it have to do with fertility awareness? But the reality is that when we go through the statistics, you'll see how prevalent it is. And even though it's not something that's commonly talked about, it's extremely prevalent. And so many, many people are affected by this. And even if you yourself, for instance, haven't experienced sexual violence, you probably know someone who has. And so all of us are impacted by it one way or the other. And so in part 2 of the series on Friday, I'm doing an interview with Dr. Erica Berman, who is a counseling psychologist in Toronto. And she works primarily with couples who are struggling with infertility and often have a history of sexual abuse or sexual assault. And we really get into how that history can not only impact your fertility, but even the experience of going through fertility treatments and even the decision as to when you choose to have children, how the abuse impacts your relationship. So we really get into a lot of the different ways about how sexual abuse can actually impact your fertility. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Erin to the show. So welcome to the show, Erin.
Hi.
Thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, it's fun that we get the chance to work together again.
Absolutely. It's been a long time. I'm excited about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did a short intro, but maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about your background and the work that you've done in the field of sexual education, sexual assault education, and your master's thesis and the PhD that you're working on right now.
Okay, sounds good. Well, after I worked with you on the Dream Team at the Sexual Assault Center, so after being a public educator at the Sexual Assault Center, I went on to be the director of volunteer services, and that's at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton. And so that position was really about training and managing our 24-hour crisis line volunteers. So I taught volunteers how to take crisis line calls, how to work with people, how to talk to people that had been sexually abused or anything related to sexual violence. And it was just incredible. I had the amazing job of working with people who were passionate and just really invested in making a difference in this issue. And yeah, during that time, I was really starting to find that when I spoke with people who experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault, I could really start to see that I could help in a kind of crisis situation. My skills were really good for helping with that, but I started to notice that I could really tell where the limits of my skills were and where I kind of couldn't go with them any further. I couldn't help any more than what I was doing. And so at that point, I decided that I wanted to do a master's degree in counseling. So I wanted to learn more about how to help more around sexual abuse. So I moved to Victoria and I did my master's in counseling at the University of Victoria. And so I finished that in 2012. And my project was on sexual assault prevention programs. So I reviewed and looked at sexual assault prevention and just getting an idea of what people are doing and what works well and where the challenges are. Yeah, so from there, now here I am in 2015, and I'm about a year away from completing my PhD at the University of Alberta. And this PhD is in the Department of Psychiatry, and we're looking at child sexual abuse prevention. So we've developed and now we're evaluating a child sexual abuse education program. And when I say prevention, I guess I mean not just, it is about preventing or trying to prevent sexual abuse from happening, but it's also about finding ways to support adults, so non-offending adults, adults who haven't abused children, but who are caring and supportive and work with kids. We're trying to find ways to support them to intervene with children so that maybe kids who have experienced abuse can get help sooner, or have a more positive experience when they disclose, or and with the hope that in the long term we can help mitigate some of the long-term effects of sexual abuse by making their experience moving forward after being abused a little bit more positive.
Oh, that's amazing work, Erin. I don't know. Yeah, you're amazing.
Well, it's been pretty rewarding along the way. Like I think I'm often asked by people how I can do this work, and it kind of always like it surprises me. I think I'm repeatedly surprised by the question because I don't find it hard to do, and the reason is that I just I get to hear about some of the moments that are the hardest or scariest or hardest to talk about in people's lives. And with that, I hear all of the things that these men and women are doing to try to stay healthy or to move forward or to live the way that they want to. And it's inspiring. It's filled with hope. So I'm always surprised when when people say, "How can you do this?" And I kind of go, "Well, how could I not do it? It's incredible. It's amazing. It's powerful. It's hopeful."
Well, maybe before we get into the program, you touched on something I think is really important. I was actually having a conversation at work the other day, and one of my colleagues this topic came up for various reasons. I think it's because of a file I was working on. And, there's definitely that idea that if a person experiences sexual assault or abuse or child sexual abuse, that they're scarred forever and they can never heal. So because you touched on that and how rewarding it is and how inspiring it is to work with people who've experienced these negative things, but are obviously not broken forever and living their lives, maybe you could just touch on that a little bit, that whole idea that if a person experiences abuse, that they're broken.
Yeah, well, and I think that idea is really perpetuated in a lot of the shows that TV shows, media sources, movies that show survivors of sexual assault. And I think very often, if you watch shows like Special Victims Unit on Law and Order, for example, people who have been sexually assaulted or sexually abused represented in shows like that are very often represented as just permanently damaged, not functional in any way, completely ruined. They're represented very often or talked about as ruined. And of course, it's so important when we talk about this to never minimize the struggle or the pain or the hurt that people experience, but without perpetuating this myth that once a person has experienced sexual violence, they're completely ruined. I think healing is complicated, and it's healing is not a straight path. It's not a linear path, but it happens, and people feel better. People feel strong.
Yeah, it's not this easy thing that just happens, kind of like grieving, because grieving doesn't happen in a line either. You go through different phases, and then you end up feeling like you first did, and then you feel fine for a while, and it goes back and forth. And so I think I think it's a really great way to start this podcast actually today, to kind of get at that whole myth, that because once we get into the prevalence, it happens to a lot of people, unfortunately, and, everyone isn't broken. Obviously, you can't minimize the impact that it has, but like you said, there's hope. So I guess before we get into all the specifics about what behaviors fall under the definition of sexual assault and abuse, maybe we could talk a little bit about the prevalence. And I know you had mentioned that for your PhD work, you had been really looking at some of those statistics more in depth and challenging some of the ones that we used to use back when we used to do presentations.
Mm-hmm. So my supervisor and I published a review article in 2013 asking the question, how much does sexual abuse happen in Canada? And it's a tough question to answer because we actually don't know as much about it as we do about other things that happen in our community. Sexual abuse or sexual assault is a tough one to get a really good idea about because it's so hard for people to talk about. But we did look at as much recent Canadian literature, Canadian research as we could. And what we concluded is that if you look at sexual abuse that involves some kind of contact, so that would be, something like touching of genitals, or if there's some kind of penetration, some kind of contact between the people involved, then we estimated that about 1 in 6 girls and 1 in 12 boys experience that kind of abuse. If you include exposure abuse, so that would be something like exposure to pornography, where there isn't contact necessarily, but there is a sexual abuse happening, then that number would go up higher. And we weren't able to pin down a number there, but it would be much higher than that 1 in 6 girls and 1 in 12 boys. And then if you include, again, sexual assault that would happen, so if you're looking at a lifetime of sexual abuse as well as sexual assault that would happen in adulthood, it could be as high as 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 boys or men who experience some type of sexual assault or sexual abuse at some point in their lifetime. It's staggering.
Yeah, it's staggering, and I think I find that people don't talk about it. I used to work in the field, and so I felt like I was kind of, you have your hand on the pulse. You kind of know what's happening. And now that I don't work within the field of sexual assault awareness anymore, I don't really hear a lot about it. And I don't really, I know that it happens and I know that it's so prevalent, but for some reason, people are just not talking about it.
Yeah.
And then when it comes up in conversation, oftentimes it's kind of wrapped in the common myths and misconceptions. And so, speaking of myths and misconceptions, so when you hear statistics like that, who's doing the abusing? Because I still feel like even though all these years have passed since we used to do this work, we're still scared of the creepy stranger, and we're not really thinking about the fact that the majority of sexual assaults happen from people that we actually know.
That like the for me, the crazy thing about these myths is that it has been so many years since we did this work full time in terms of public education. So when we were out in the community every day teaching people, challenging myths, teaching people about sexual assault, what has it been, 10 years?
Has it been 10
Something
years?
like that.
Yeah.
So
Oh my goodness.
it's still the same. None of this stuff has changed. These myths that we're going to talk about more, they haven't changed. They're still there. It seems as though the same conversations are still happening over and over and over again, and I find that incredibly frustrating, but it just speaks to the importance of still having this conversation. So, in terms of who's doing the abuse, we in that review article I was talking about, we found, based on the Canadian sources that we were looking at, that about 95% of sexual abuse is perpetrated by somebody that the child or the family knows. And that number is really consistent with other research that's been published. 95% is a pretty common number to hear for that. So that means that although we hear about stranger sexual abuse or sexual assault all the time, it's actually only about 5% of situations that's perpetrated by a stranger.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think it's hard. I think people hear that statistic, but it's so easy to say, like, well, that couldn't happen to me. Like, it's no one that I know. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that is, I mean, we'll talk about that more, but I think that it just plays into that whole thing. So before I go and delve into the myths, which I'm like biting my tongue not to, let's go through some definitions. So I think it's important when having a conversation about sexual assault, sexual violence, to kind of establish what we're talking about. Because obviously, when you're talking about these issues, we could assume that everybody knows exactly what sexual assault is, or what rape is, or what child sexual abuse is. But oftentimes, we're not on the same page. So maybe we could start by talking about what is rape and why in Canada we don't actually use that term.
Yeah, rape is a term that I hear all the time. It's actually an American term. So rape refers specifically to forced penetration. So usually it's forced penile vaginal penetration. So the term's pretty limiting in the sense that only a very few, very specific acts fall under that term. So we don't use it in Canada. Legally, in our criminal justice system, we use the term sexual assault. And that's because sexual assault includes much more than penetration, although it does include penetration as well. But sexual assault is any type of sexual contact that's without voluntary consent. So that could be forced kissing, it could be touching the genitals, it could be genital and mouth contact, it could involve vaginal penetration, anal penetration, and any other kind of sexual act that I didn't include there. But the key being that it's without voluntary consent. And so that term in Canada, we've moved to using that term so that we can capture this broad range of things that happen to people that are abusive.
Mm-hmm. And then the definition of child sexual abuse is even a little bit different to that. So maybe you could talk, because obviously child sexual abuse would encompass all of those things that we discussed,
Mm-hmm.
but it actually includes more types of behavior that aren't included in those other two definitions.
Yeah, and the difference, well, so as a specific definition, child sexual abuse is the improper exposure of a child to sexual contact, activity, or behavior. And so that would include the things that I said in sexual assault, but it also includes things like exhibitionism, which is showing genitals, for example, to a child. It includes exposure to pornography as well as sexual contact. So it's a broader definition. And another thing that's important with sexual abuse is that if we're talking about child sexual abuse, consent is not an issue. So a child under the age of 12 cannot consent to sexual activity. That means that it doesn't matter the specifics of what happened or what didn't happen, the child cannot consent. So that's a key difference when we're talking about child sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so important, and I don't think that people really know, and I think that's why the definitions are so important. I think it's important to note that you can experience a sexual assault even if you don't know that that's what it is. You're still impacted by it, and that's why these definitions are so important, because it can help to clarify what happened. Because you could still have that feeling of like something happened, I don't know, I don't feel like myself, I'm having all of these, effects and emotions, and I don't know why, because it wasn't really that bad what happened to me. But then if you know what the definition is, it can really help to clarify why you're feeling that way.
And I've spoken to so many people over the years that have said, something like, I don't know why I'm so upset because this thing happened to me. So without defining it for themselves as a sexual assault, so I've heard, things like, well, this thing, or when it happened, or after he did that to me, or she did that to me. So I still a sense that something wasn't right, and I'm having things happen as a result. So I've been finding myself crying uncontrollably at random moments, and I don't understand why. And that's really common for people to have to not define an experience as sexual assault and still be experiencing the impact of what happened to them because it wasn't consensual. And it can be really confusing, because if what happened to me, to make sense of what happened when it's hasn't quite been defined as a sexual assault.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like that whole idea of like, I had this bad sexual experience this one time. And that's how you kind of frame it, because no one
Exactly.
ever explained what the definitions are. Because unless you're fortunate enough to sit in a class or something and have a presentation about sexualized violence, these things aren't necessarily brought to your attention.
Exactly.
And so, as you mentioned, in the Canadian Criminal Code, consent is
Mm-hmm.
key, and voluntary consent is really what it comes down to. And there was this article that I'll link to in the show notes that I thought was brilliant, because I think often people have a hard time, conceptualizing what consent really means. But the article basically took it outside of the context of sexual assault and brought it into tea drinking. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's what I loved about it, because I feel like it really drives the point home. So in the Canadian Criminal Code, is it 5 different ways that consent is defined? No,
Five.
5. But basically, consent is defined as a voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity, which seems pretty basic. But the criminal code actually breaks it down into several different categories, which we'll go through. So the first one, consent cannot be given by somebody else. So in the tea example, if you're sitting at a party and someone asks you if you want tea, and you're in the middle of answering and your friend comes along and says, "Of course you want some tea." Well, obviously you didn't consent for it, but there are situations where someone else will. Maybe Erin, you could talk a little bit about some examples.
Yeah. I'm thinking of, say, I'm making this up, but an example where, say, a boyfriend tells a friend, my my partner's in that room, she's ready to go, she really likes to have sex, it'd be really hot if you went in there and had sex with her, and I'll watch. He can't do that.
Yeah.
It's She has to consent for herself. um, I don't That's so an example that comes to mind is if there's, for example, a teenage child, a parent cannot give consent for another person to have sex with that teenager. So if the person's, it's not, I'm not, I have a hard time like explaining this, but this is like real. This happens. Like if the parent is, say, prostituting out their teenage child, like they can't consent. They can't say, oh yeah, she's fine with it, go have sex with her and then collect money. But that would be like a real example.
Yeah. So it sounds, that's why I say it kind of sounds really straightforward, but unfortunately, this is a situation that actually happens. So they've clarified in the criminal code that, that only that individual can actually give consent for themselves. And the second aspect of consent that we touched on, consent can't be obtained when a person's abusing their position of power, trust, or authority. Mm-hmm. And I think this is really important. I think it should be an important part of sex education. So, Erin, I'm not sure if you've seen all in the media about Ontario revamping the sex ed curriculum, but it's a big deal. A lot of parents didn't want the curriculum to be revamped. And one of the kind of aspects of the curriculum is trying to add consent as a mandatory piece of the curriculum. And to me, it seems so basic. But I think that it's important for everybody to know, but especially children of school age, to know that it doesn't actually matter how old you are. If you're under if a person is abusing their position of trust, so if you have a teacher or a soccer coach or some hockey coach who's abusing that position of trust, you can't actually consent to that person. So it doesn't even matter if you have a crush on your teacher. Legally, you actually can't consent when you're under 18.
Absolutely.
To someone who's in a position of power. So that's Canadian laws. So depending on where you're listening, it might be different. But I think it's important to know, and it's something that I wish every teenager and every adult and everyone just in general knew that, because I think when you're, in school, because I think a lot of people can remember, maybe a certain awkward situation in school, student-teacher situation, and people think, oh, well, it's stereotypical gender roles. She's a slut or whatever. Or she was flirting with the teacher. It actually doesn't matter if she throws herself at the teacher. Mm-hmm. She actually can't consent. And that's just the way that the law works in Canada.
Yeah, the position of trust, the position of power is really important, because it links back to that, that consent has to be given voluntarily. And if one of the people is in, even if we're talking about adults, if one of the people is in a position of power or a position of trust, it makes that voluntary piece harder to be 100% sure about. So when we're talking about adults, it doesn't mean that an adult can never consent to sexual activity with a person in a position of power. An adult can, but it starts to get tricky, because what are the consequences if I say no? What are the consequences if I'm not comfortable with this? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to be demoted? Is it going to have an implication on my pay scale? These are the kinds of things that can start to come in play. And so if there's a situation where the person in a position of trust or power is using that power or trust to get the agreement to the sexual activity, in the Criminal Code of Canada, it says that consent is not valid. It's not okay. So if the police officer says, well, I might be able to be lenient if you perform this sexual act for me, then it doesn't matter if the other person says, okay, the consent's not valid, because the position of trust or the position of power has been violated.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I was going to say, so in your tea example, then, that would be like taking a course and your teacher or your professor says to you, you might fail if you don't drink this cup of tea I poured for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's why I love the tea example, because it just takes it outside of that context and really drives it home.
Yeah, because no, yeah, when you think of it in a cup of tea, no one, I mean, that's ridiculous. Like, I have to drink a cup of tea or you're going to fail me. Like,
Yeah.
it's not, of course, I don't want the tea. It's not a voluntary, or of course, it's not voluntary. If I drink that tea, it's not because I wanted to, it's because you threatened me or,
Yeah.
whatever.
And maybe it's not like you drink it the one time. Maybe it's that you have to drink it whenever I ask you to.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I would have had the tea if it was a different kind of tea. Or
Mm-hmm.
maybe the tea was too hot. Maybe it's the temperature of the tea that I'm actually not liking. It burns my tongue, and I don't like it when the tea burns my tongue.
Yeah. Or maybe I don't want it right now. Maybe I have something on my mind right now, but if I can finish this task, I wouldn't mind having it in a couple of hours. So there's so many different variations there, and it's the same thing with sexual activity. And I think that that the whole position of trust or authority, it leads perfectly into one of the next aspects of consent, which is if you didn't actually say the word no, which is a pretty big one.
Yeah.
So Erin, let's talk about the ways that a person can say no without actually using the word no.
Oh man, I mean, people say no in so many different ways. And we used to do this exercise when we would go to junior highs and high schools. And what we do is we'd ask for volunteers from the audience, and then we'd get them up to the front, and we'd ask them, and we would tell them, I think we would tell them that their boundaries were going to be pushed a little bit so that they wouldn't be too shocked. But what we do is have one person walking. Oh, I don't even remember how we used to do that, Lisa.
We used
I
to
think
put
we used
them,
to go,
so we'd put two people, we'd bring up two volunteers, and then we would stand them facing each other, and we'd have them look into each other's eyes. That was important,
right, right.
to increase the creepy factor. And so then we would have one person stay stationary, and we would have the other person walk towards the one person. And I think we would let them walk and not tell them necessarily to stop. And there would be that feeling. So if you've ever been in a situation where you just had that feeling, like say, like I'll just give a stereotypical example. Like I'm at the bar and I'm chatting with, my girlfriend Erin, and some guy comes up to me and he comes way too close to my face and he
Hmm.
starts saying stuff maybe, and it's just really awkward, and it's that feeling where your hair kind of stands on end,
Yeah.
and the whole class would feel it. And so even though, that person didn't say anything, because usually there was silence, there was no speaking. And then, we break it up. So we'd break it
Yeah.
up and talk about it and
And
laugh
then
and whatever.
we would ask the class, was were they comfortable up here? So with both people, was this a comfortable situation? And of course, everyone would say no, it was so uncomfortable. And then we would ask, well, how do you know that? Nothing was said. How do you know it was uncomfortable? And it would like the room would just all these different answers would come forward, and it would be body language, well, as this person got closer, their steps slowed down and got smaller. The other person started leaning way back, and the closer the walker got, the farther back the person standing still leaned. They started laughing uncomfortably, but it wasn't a real laugh, it was an uncomfortable laugh. All of these different answers would come up because it was so obvious to everyone in the room that even though the word no wasn't spoken, it was uncomfortable with the body language alone. So whenever I hear this, if someone says, and it's not uncommon to hear that, but I didn't say no, I wasn't clear enough, so I should have said no, or if other people say, well, if she had said no, she wouldn't have been sexually assaulted. If he had been more clear about it, this wouldn't have happened. No, we're always communicating with our body language, even if we don't mean to, or no, because that's the other thing we used to ask. We used to ask our volunteers, did you know that you were doing that? And most of the time they would say no, they didn't even realize it. They weren't even aware that their bodies were doing that. So their nonverbal communication was so clear and not unintentional. So it's there. It's always there.
Yeah, and I think it gets at a really important myth, which is it's kind of this weird way that the way that our culture is around sexual assault, which we'll get into more. But it's this weird way that our culture is kind of allowing the all of the fault to go to the person experiencing the abuse. So instead of all of us being human beings and being responsible for our actions, and if to be aware of our own actions. So if I'm hanging out with somebody and I accidentally lean in too close and I see that that person's uncomfortable, I know they're uncomfortable, and so healthy human beings would just come out of that person's personal space and say, oh, so I'm sorry, I tripped, I didn't mean to come so close to you. We've all experienced that. The difference is that perpetrators of assault don't really care because they're not going for consent. That's obviously why they're choosing to bypass all of your body signals, but it's not to say that they didn't see it. And so I think that's a really important point. And so to kind of tie it up with the tea example, it'd basically be like, so imagine you're sitting there with, a friend of yours and, they ask you if you want some tea, and, you kind of just stare at them kind of funny, and then maybe you look at the wall and you kind of just, your body language is really closed and maybe you tense up. Yeah, you didn't say no, but you'd probably be like, all right, she doesn't want the tea. It's pretty clear.
If you wanted the tea, you would have said yes, please.
Yeah.
You didn't say yes, please. So
yeah.
The rest means no, even if you don't say the words.
Yeah, and then the creepy person then who completely violates, that individual's boundaries, to take the example to a next level. Then so your friend's staring at the wall and they're like, they clearly don't want tea, and so you forcibly open their mouth and pour the tea down their throat.
Yeah.
So obviously,
not okay.
Not okay. Okay, and so then. Maybe, Erin, you could talk about the next aspect of consent, which is if the person is actually not able to.
Yeah, so our criminal code in Canada says really clearly that there are situations where a person's not able to give consent, and that would be if a person is incapable, which is passed out, sleeping, really, really drunk, really, really high, something like that. Unconscious would fall under there. So with this one, it's not to say that a person who's drunk can't give consent, but we're talking about kind of a level of drunkenness where they're no longer able to give consent. So if a person is like in and out of consciousness, is confused, is throwing up on themselves, isn't likely to remember tomorrow, is slurring, then no, the person's not able to give consent. It's just not acceptable. And I think, yeah, this one gets confused, I think, because people kind of say, yeah, but I've had sex when I was drunk before and that was okay, and yeah, a person can have consensual sex when they're drunk, but there is a point where they're no longer able to give consent.
Yeah, of course. Maybe for example, the point at which they can barely open their eyes and they don't even know what's going on. And I think that part of the reason that people have a hard time understanding why you'd even have to talk about it is because most people have healthy kind of, boundaries when it comes to stuff like that. Like if someone's passed out on the floor, again, you're not going to open their mouth and shove tea down their throat because they can't drink it because they're passed out. And I think the hard reality is that it's really hard to kind of comprehend that there are people out there that would do something like that. Yeah. And I think that's what it really comes down to as to why people have a hard time, understanding and kind of recognizing, like, why would you even have to say that? I mean, why would you even do that?
And most people, if Lisa, you passed out, if you got really, really drunk and you passed out and you had a cup of tea in your hands, hot tea, most people would stop and take the tea out of your hands because they don't want you to burn yourself, make sure that you're okay, put you in the recovery position, which I learned in first aid is a good position for people who are drunk. Maybe make sure that you get home safe. That's what I think most of us kind of think of when we think of, well, and I think this is why sometimes it's hard for people to wrap their head around, because it's like, well, But why would you take advantage of a person who was drunk? Like, if I saw someone passed out on the street, I wouldn't, even if they're naked, I would put a blanket on them, make sure that they're okay,
Yeah.
move that cup of tea away, not pour the tea in their mouth. Like, it doesn't make sense. But unfortunately, this one, I hear so many times alcohol being involved in sexual assaults, and I think this is really needs to be cleared up. It's really important that we clear this up. That bottom line, if a person is very intoxicated, very high, is for whatever reason not completely with it, then don't engage in sexual activity with them. It's not okay. It's not acceptable. It's illegal.
Yeah.
Aside from all the other stuff,
Yeah.
it is illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then what happens if, like, I meet this guy or this girl, depending on the situation, and, we're enjoying ourselves. And then at some point, I'm not enjoying myself anymore. And so I don't actually want to continue.
Yeah. So the criminal code is really clear that you can change your mind. Consent has to be given for each situation, and it can be removed at any point in time. So just because you've agreed to one thing, like kissing, doesn't mean that you've automatically agreed to touching in any way. And just because you agreed initially doesn't mean that it's like you are all in and you can't go back. No, you can change your mind, you can stop any point in time. It doesn't matter the specifics. It doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter what happened. It doesn't matter how close the other person was to orgasming. None of that matters. You can change your mind at any point in time.
Yeah. And I mean, you can put that into context and think to yourself, so if you've been at some point in a relationship with a supportive partner, and you've been engaging in whatever, it doesn't even have to be sexual activity, but for the purpose of the example, like, so you've been engaging in sexual activity and like you get like a kink in your neck or like your foot hurts or whatever, and you kind of like, oh, my neck hurts or whatever, like, generally speaking, in a healthy supportive relationship, your partner would kind of back off and be like, oh my God, are you okay? Like, whatever. And so that's how it's supposed to be. So if you're in the middle of sexual activity and you no longer feel comfortable with it, or even perhaps you were comfortable with, one thing, but then something else was introduced and you weren't comfortable with that, the consent, it's an ongoing negotiation that you have with the person that you're with. It's not a one-time thing. And same thing goes for if you're in a relationship with somebody. So I remember years ago having conversations about this, and you can't be sexually assaulted if you're married to the person. That's crazy. Well, just because you're married to someone doesn't actually mean that you're obligated to have sex whenever they want or all the time, or consent is still, it's not necessarily formal. You're not signing a contract every time, but you still kind of informally negotiate that consent for each sexual activity.
Mm-hmm. And even within an ongoing relationship, whether that's a marriage or a long-term partnership, or whether that's two people that have engaged in sexual activity in the past and are doing it again, still consent needs to be obtained each time, but also for each activity. So each activity each time. So just because in the past I was okay, or last time, or yesterday, or this morning I was okay with, say, anal sex, doesn't mean that this time I am automatically, and that you can assume that consent is there. For each activity each time, it has to be obtained regardless of your relationship. That it has to be obtained each time.
Yeah. So if every single night, Erin and I are hanging out and I offer her mint tea, and she usually says, sure, I'd like some mint tea. So on Thursday night, I asked her if she wants some mint tea, and she says, actually, I think I want mango tea. And I go and I make mint tea and I force her to drink it. Well, that's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Or
Same.
maybe you've already made the mint tea for me because you were being thoughtful, and you know that I always like mint tea. So you make me a cup of mint tea, and I come over and you say, Erin, here's your mint tea. I made it just the way you like it. And I say, I don't really feel like mint tea tonight. Well, you have to say, okay, and dump the tea. You don't get to say, but I made this for you and you liked it last night and it's how you like it and I made it because I love you. No, no mint tea, not tonight.
Yeah. Well, and I think that leads perfectly into, so when it comes to consent, I think that one of the most negative and, detrimental tools that, perpetrators of sexual assault use against those who they're assaulting is coercion. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that coercion often leaves the person who was assaulted feeling as though they consented and feeling as though they gave in, maybe that they weren't strong enough. I wish I would have done something. I should have been clearer in my words. And basically, coercion is when a person uses guilt, threats, or false promises, or even imply a threat, so that that person really feels as though they don't have a choice for whatever reason. And so that can be somebody just asking repeatedly. And sometimes I don't think people realize what this looks like. So when you've worked in the field, sexual assault, like Erin and I have, you hear a lot of survivor stories. Sometimes coercion goes on for hours. And then in the case of child sexual abuse, grooming and coercion can go on for months.
Yeah.
So it's a very complicated situation that really leaves the survivor often feeling quite guilty, like it was their fault.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could expand on that a little.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of an example where someone said to me that eventually she realized that the the sex was so it was sexual assault, but what she said was eventually she realized the sex was going to happen either way, whether she agreed to it or not. So she agreed to get it over with so that she could get out and get home.
Yeah.
And she was so just confused and conflicted and didn't understand why she was having the reaction that she was, because she felt as though she had agreed. She felt as though she had consented. And yet, she was having a hard time sleeping at night. She couldn't look at this person anymore. It was a person that she knew, an acquaintance. And, she was devastated because the tool the tool of force that was used was coercion. This person didn't use physical force. This person used coercive force, which is far more common. Sometimes we hear about sexual abuse and sexual assault that uses some kind of physical force. That happens. Most often we hear about coercion. It's the most commonly used tool in sexual assault and sexual abuse situations.
Well, and I think something that is kind of lost in most discussions about sex and sexual education, and even when you're talking about sexual violence, is that sex is supposed to be fun and enjoyable, pleasurable. People
Mm-hmm.
have sex because it feels good. And there's a lot to be said for that. And so, an example that I thought of when you were talking, Erin, that I've heard many times is kind of like that situation where, you're with somebody. Obviously, you're not really wanting to go through with it. And eventually, after however many minutes or hours of this kind of coercive, whether it's physical kind of coercion, like you kind of trying to touch and then the person's moving their hand and then you kind of going back for it and back for it, back for it, or whether it's like the come on, come on, come on, or whatever it is, you want it, whatever. Eventually, after all of this, and it goes on, and just like you said, eventually, the person realizes that it's going to happen. Well, could you at least put on a condom? That is not excitement. That is not pleasure. That is not the type of, sexual experience that's enjoyable. If someone's saying, could you at least put a condom on? They're saying, clearly you're going to do this anyways. Could you just make sure I don't get an STI?
Yeah.
That's not consent.
Well, and I think I'm glad that you brought that up, that about sex being enjoyable and joyful and pleasurable, because I do think it gets separated. I think often when we talk about sexual assault and sexual abuse as professionals, we do separate and I think we do that intentionally. We try to separate, consensual sex. We try to just move it straight out of our discussion because we want to be so clear that these are not the same thing. We're talking about different things. Non-consensual sexual activity isn't sexual activity, it's sexual assault. And yet what we miss when we do that is this important, critical piece that you brought up, that, we should be talking about things that are pleasurable and enjoyable. And if they're not, then we need to look at it more. And, there might be different reasons why it's not pleasurable or enjoyable for a person, but it might be because it's coercive. It might be because it's not consensual. It might be because the consent was not, the consent was not, yes, I'm in. I want to do this. Let's go. It might be because it was more of a, well, I guess I'm not really sure, but well, okay, if you're quick, then that's not pleasurable. That's not enjoyable. That's not, okay, let's go for it. I'm in.
Well, and I think the problem with like all the rape prevention myths, like the cover your drink, the this, the that, the don't go out at night, all that kind of stuff. I think the problem with that is that it misses the point. I feel like there needs to be education to stereotype gender role. There needs to be education to men and boys as well as girls and women, so that we all kind of come to expect sexual experiences to be pleasurable and expect and want our partners to be enthusiastic, because that would make a more pleasurable and enjoyable experience. So I feel like, we should be teaching that if your partner isn't like, hell yes, that's a no. Do you want to have sex with someone who's kind of like, I don't know? And I mean, it's, what I'm getting at by that. And I feel like we always focus on, again, the stereotypical, what the woman should have done and this and that. And I think most healthy men and women know this. Sex is more fun when you're having it with someone who actually wants it.
Well, and I think, and this is a little bit off topic, but it's totally relevant. I think, we live in a world where there's a lot of kind of machoism. There's a lot of pressure for men to be a certain way, to be men. And I think there's a lot of amazing men who are challenging that and try finding different ways to be men and to be strong men. But often this machoism is really tied in with being a man. And I just, as you were saying that, I was thinking, imagine if we lived in a world where if a guy said to his friend, oh yeah, I totally like
nailed her
last night. I totally nailed her. I totally banged her. I convinced her to do it even though she wasn't really into it. I'm such a man. Like I'm such a stud. Imagine if we lived in this world where the general reaction was that's not manly, that's not studly. That's what's manly is to have a woman or that's really heterosexist. What's manly is to have a partner who's, what was the word you used? Fully enthusiastic.
Yeah.
That's manly. And
what's manlier would be that if your partner isn't into it, that you're not interested, that you're like, manly, you know what? Yes. I can see that you're uncomfortable. And so, let's just stop and let's just have some tea. Then that would mean that particular individual is secure enough in themselves that they don't need to have that sexual activity. Their manlyhood isn't tied to this action. They can just be comfortable with respecting the person's boundaries. And I think the majority of people do get that.
I agree.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. Yeah.
And I think that's why it's really hard for people to kind of understand what's happening and also to kind of maybe empathize with a person who has been assaulted, because since we have such a hard time imagining that there are people that could be so wretched and just completely violate other people's boundaries. I think because we have such a hard time understanding that aspect of it, that we're more likely to think that it must be something that that person did to bring it on, or some way that they weren't being clear. Because in your rational mind, you think to yourself, no, 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 but if my friend had been clear with so and so, they would have stopped, because you're thinking that that person is like you, that they're rational and that they're a normal, well, I shouldn't say normal, but a healthy human being with healthy boundaries.
Yeah, and I think, I absolutely agree that most people aren't using coercion to get sexual activity. I do think that. And I've also heard, having a foot in the door of hearing survivors' stories, there are people that are using coercion, and whether it's the same people over and over again, I don't know. But it's, when you work in this area and you hear people's stories on a regular basis, there are some pretty coercive people and doing some pretty coercive things. And so, I think it's important to acknowledge that not every person that, is around the corner, or everybody on your street, or, everyone at your kid's school is creepy and bad. And yet anyone who's experienced this kind of thing knows that seemingly kind and nice people are sometimes can be quite coercive as well.
Mm-hmm. So I guess we should get into some of the myths about sexual assault. And I think it hurts my heart that these myths are still alive and well, because we spent so many years trying to address them. But I think it's just part of our culture. And I think that this is something that we'll continually have to talk about. But one of the myths, especially pertaining to sexual assault of men and boys, is the whole idea that men don't even get sexually assaulted, that it's very rare, and that it's basically a woman's issue, that it mostly happens to women. I think that in the media, it kind of comes out in certain ways that men do get assaulted with some of the shows. The example that's coming to mind, Erin, I don't know if you subjected yourself to Sons of Anarchy.
No, sorry.
It's a good idea, good call. I know everyone loved it, so I checked it out. But there was a lot of images in that show about sexual assault of men, mostly in the prison context. And I think that it's easy for people to look at that and really not ever think that it could happen to like your typical man,
Yeah.
because of the way that it's portrayed in the media and in television.
Yeah. Well, and I think we have an idea of men as kind of being big and strong and able to fight off a sexual assault if it were going to happen. But, we were just talking about coercion, and coercion still exists for men. They're not immune to it. It's not, you can't use your fists to fight off coercion. And as well, it's people don't always respond the way that they think they would if they find themselves in a sexual assault situation. And so, it's one thing to say, oh, well, if I'm a man and if that ever happened to me, I would just fight this person and kick them in the nuts and run away. But it just doesn't, you just never know how you're going to respond. And so it's just not a good argument, I think, for men.
Yeah, and of course, looking back, so if someone was abused, if a man was abused in childhood, you don't really, when you're looking back, kind of like if you're remembering what happened, you don't really remember yourself at that particular age. You don't really remember how small you were, how young you were.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of think of you at that time, and now you're an adult. So that could be a source of a lot of guilt and shame, because you think
Mm-hmm.
to yourself, I should have done this or I should have done that, not really considering that you were just a child. And the same thing could apply to
Mm-hmm.
women, of course.
Mm-hmm. And I think we also think of men as there's a stereotype about men being more sexual than women, or always wanting to have sex, always being ready to go. And so sometimes I think it can be hard for people to wrap their head around a man being sexually assaulted because, and I think it can be hard for men themselves to wrap their heads around because I should have wanted the sex. I should have wanted what was happening. And I think this can even, if you think of examples with, say, a teenager with a teacher, it's like people, I've heard this so many times and I find it so just upsetting to hear, well, he's lucky to have had an older woman show interest in him. He obviously would have loved it because men love sex, they love physical attention. But the truth is that just like women, men have preferences and sometimes they don't want to have sex. Like, if you're down on the couch with a terrible flu, maybe you don't want to have sex. That's normal. That's okay. And there are lots of other times when men don't want to have sex either, or aside from, if they're sick. But, it's just really important to acknowledge that, that men don't always want to have sex. They're just not. And I've said this to men and to teenagers in high schools. And I've had the response of, yes, we do. And I'm like, no, you don't.
How about right now? Like, how about this second?
Yeah.
In front of everybody.
It's just silly.
You know what I mean? Because, like, it's so easy to say, and I think that comes into that whole machismo thing, because you're around your buddies, and they're... So I in the example that you used with the teenage, boy with their teacher, for example, so what if the teenage boy didn't really want it, but felt like he should want it and felt like he needs to do this because if he doesn't, he's not a real man? That's highly problematic.
Well, and then imagine also some of the confusion for that man moving forward in his life and trying to make sense of what happened, trying even to define what happened. That can be really confusing. And, I kind of had a thought as we were talking that I think talking about fertility and sexual assault or sexual abuse, I think is really easy. And I think even as I was preparing for this talk, I think I was even thinking more about a woman in a partnership as being the survivor of sexual assault or abuse and the impact on fertility or the impact on trying to conceive in that case. But it very well could be if there's a man in the partnership, it very well could be the man who's struggling with some of these issues, because we know that men are sexually assaulted and sexually abused, and that there's a lot more men than we even know about who have experienced this kind of abuse.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I think that it comes into play in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So when you have children, if you've experienced abuse, that can change the way that it could really strike terror into you, thinking that this could happen to your child, to the point where maybe you wait, you delay having children for a longer period of time because of those feelings, those kind of mixed feelings that are coming up as a result of the assault. Mm-hmm. And I think another complication or challenge for, male survivors of sexual assault and abuse is that if the perpetrator is male, so if you were abused as a child and you're a boy and you were abused by a man, that can lead to questions about your own sexuality. Like, did that person see something in me? Am I gay? Am I straight? And I think that that's really complicated. Just a really complicated experience for men, because especially since we don't really talk about sexual assault, we don't really have the language around it. Most people don't really know what consent is, and most people don't really have a definition of what sexual assault is, let alone to really understand that it's not about sexual assault is very different to sexual activity, in the sense that, as we talked about, sexual activity is consensual, pleasurable, enjoyable, to consenting individuals who want to do it. Sexual abuse is a completely different thing. And in sexual abuse, sex is used as a tool of violence. And so it's irregardless of your sexuality.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said.
Yeah, it's just that whole idea really, I guess the whole idea that a person can internalize that and really think it and then if what happens if the survivor is gay, and then they worry that they're gay because of the assault or the abuse. And I think those are important things to to talk about. And like I said, it makes the experience a lot more complex for that person.
I think I'm just trying to think back. I'm trying to think, and I think most of the men that I've spoken with who've experienced assault or abuse have in some way questioned their sexuality, and that looking unique for each specific situation depending on their own sexuality, sexual their orientation and the gender of the offender and all of that. But sexuality being questioned, I think, is incredibly common for men who've experienced abuse. Am I gay? Am I straight? Am I bisexual? Am I none of the above? Is there something wrong with me because I didn't like what happened? I'm a man. I should like sex, tying into all these ideas about men wanting sex and yeah.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other myths that is alive and well is the myth that, of course, if you were drinking, that it's your fault, that you played a role. And I think that one's really hard. I remember when we used to go, especially when we did presentations outside of the high school context and we did presentations to organizations, it was often adult women that would have the hardest time with this myth, in the sense that there's really like, we would, correct me if I'm wrong, Erin, but I just distinctly remember always hearing like, but she has to take some responsibility for the situation.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that it's so interesting. I feel that sometimes when you're critical of others, often when you're critical of others, it's really about your own insecurity. And I think that believing that if you didn't drink, you wouldn't get assaulted is kind of like a security blanket.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all need that to some extent. We all need to feel like we're in control of our lives.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have that, then how can you go through the world?
Yeah.
But I mean, the fact is, drinking is something that's socially acceptable. So whether or not you drink or not, alcohol is everywhere all the time. And so there's a really big difference between, having a couple drinks and consenting to sex. These things are not related.
Yeah. And I think, if we were to take alcohol completely out of the picture, so if you look at, say, communities or countries where people don't drink alcohol, or generally speaking, alcohol isn't accepted, sexual assault, sexual abuse still happens. If we were to take it completely away from planet Earth, I'm sorry, I wish that I could say there's a different answer, but sexual assault and sexual abuse would still happen because it's not about the alcohol. And it doesn't matter if a person was drinking. As you said, alcohol is legal. So whether you use it or not, it's legal. And which means that a person is allowed, they have a right to drink it. And having a drink, having 10 drinks, is not the same as consenting to sexual activity. It's not an agreement. So it just there is no responsibility that can be given to people who are sexually assaulted when they've been drinking because of the alcohol. They just are simply not. They're just not at fault. It's not their fault that it's just not their fault that it happened, even if they were drinking. But I think this myth is really strongly held. I agree with you that it's a security blanket. I think if I can tell myself that if I don't get drunk, if I don't drink excessively, then I won't be sexually assaulted, there's a sense of safety that comes with that. And I think it's a false sense of safety, but I understand why people like it. I lock my front door when I go to bed at night,
Me too.
even though I know that somebody can still break in through my window that's ground floor and is easily acceptable. I understand that, I get it, and yet I still lock my front door and it makes me feel better. And I think the drinking thing is like that. Like people say, well, but if you don't get drunk, which is the locking of the front door, then you won't get sexually assaulted. Well, guess what? People don't just come in the front door. There are other ways to come in. It's not. I don't know if that analogy makes sense. I don't know if
Oh, it totally does.
that's a good way of describing it, but It's not about the alcohol. It's just not about the alcohol.
Well, and I feel the need to take it further because so I'm, getting into the alcohol, it makes me think about the clothing. It basically makes me think about all the things that we tell women, all the ways that we police women's behavior. And so we're not telling men not to drink, just to clarify, because I've never heard that in my life. I've never heard anyone say to men that they shouldn't drink a lot so that they wouldn't get sexually assaulted. So there's that. And so it's kind of like the ways that we as women try to protect each other. Don't drink, go out in groups, stay with your friends, cover your drink so that no one can put anything in there. And I feel like it all comes to mind together because this is all based on this stranger scenario. It's all based on the idea that some creepy guy that you don't know is going to attack you. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, because we really believe that, 96% statistic doesn't change the fact that we're all scared of creepy strangers. We're not, the fact of the matter is that that's not how this works. And so, when women are sexually assaulted and when men are sexually assaulted, it's somebody that they know. And so all those tips and all of the whole concept of being able to prevent it by doing all of these things, it just doesn't protect you from somebody that you know. Mm-hmm. Because naturally around someone that you know, your guard is down. And it's unreasonable to live your life with your guard up 100% of the time. Even around your partner, even around your best friend.
Even like if you think too about clothing, the tips, the things that women are told about, what we should and shouldn't wear in order to keep ourselves safe from sexual assault, everything, clothing, makeup, shoes, the kind of shoes we wear even. I always think that I would just one day, I'd love to try to live my life by all of these tips and follow them very, very carefully and just see the reactions that people would give me. Like, all the kinds of things I've read, like if you get on an elevator and then a man comes on the elevator after you, you should get off the elevator and wait until it's empty or there's someone else on it. So I'm just thinking to myself, how long is it going to take me to get up to the 10th floor so that I can have my doctor's appointment and then get home? Like, I'm never going to make it up the elevator if I follow all these tips. And I think I used to get really, really, really frustrated, really angry about these tips, and really angry when people would try to enforce them or try to push them on me because, when you work in this kind of area, I've heard so many different descriptions of scenarios where people have experienced sexual assault or sexual abuse. And it's anything from having, been dressed to the nines, out for the night, looking to pick up, to, having had the stomach flu and a friend coming over to help look after you and you're in your sweatpants with some puke stuck in your hair and everything in between, because it's not about what you're wearing or not wearing or any of these things. There's never an invitation for sexual assault. There's never a way that a person asks to be sexually assaulted. Each of us has a right to wear what we want and to do what we want and to be safe, to not be sexually assaulted. And I guess as I'm talking about it, I'm getting worked up again because I'm getting that little bit of like getting angry about it because I think it's a real injustice. I think it's really harmful when we buy into these ideas, and it's harmful to women and it's harmful to men, and it is absolutely harmful to survivors because when people experience sexual assault, then that's where all this questioning comes from. I'm somehow to blame. I'm somehow responsible. I did something wrong. If I had acted differently, it wouldn't have happened. Therefore, I'm somewhat to blame, and it's just not true. And yet, I understand how people buy into them because there is a sense of safety. If I follow the rules and I check off my list, I check the boxes on my list of things to do, then I won't be sexually assaulted, is the way that the mind, the thinking goes. And I understand that, and yet it's not, it doesn't work that way.
It's basically based on a lie. And as long as we continue to focus on those things, then we're not addressing the reality of the situation. I think that's what it comes down to. Like, we're not addressing the reality of the situation where, and I think that when in part 2 of the series, in my interview with Dr. Erica Berman, we talked about kind of the impact it can have on you as parents, because you want to protect your children from everything, just like you want to protect yourself from everything. And I guess what it comes down to is truly understanding what you can do that would actually make an impact in this type of situation. So I know when we established our dream team, and we had to address how we were going to talk about prevention and myths in our presentation. Our executive director said that we had to talk about prevention, and we didn't have a problem talking about prevention, but it was directed at things that could actually make a difference. And then I guess fortunately and unfortunately, it's not what people want to hear, because people really want, it's reassuring. It's like comfort food. It's like lasagna or something. People really want to hear that if all you have to do is like cover your drink, don't dress like a, whatever, like don't wear, I'm trying not to say slutty.
Yeah, stilettos.
Don't wear slutty clothes. It's just that simple. And then it'll never happen. And then, protect your kid from strangers, and it'll never happen. But the reality is that because it's the majority of the time it happens by somebody that it would be significantly more effective to actually address the issue of the people who are offending. And make it really clear about how to ask for consent, what consent is, what it's not, and to really encourage healthy, positive expressions of sexuality instead of just not talking about sexuality and hoping for the best.
That ties into another one of the myths that people really cling to, and that's that you'd be able to tell if somebody was a perpetrator or a child abuser or a child molester. And this discussion just really highlights, I think, why people cling to it. It's really, really scary. It's terrifying to fully accept and grasp that your child or yourself, that we're more likely to experience abuse by somebody that we know. And I think that statement, someone that you know, an acquaintance, that loses the real impact. Like, we're talking about a brother, an uncle, a grandma, a favorite coach. These are people that are close. The people that are offending against children, the people that are assaulting adults, they're trusted. So when we say position of trust, I mean, these are trusted. This is a people that you trust. So yeah, that's hard. That is impossible almost to wrap your head around. Yeah. So then it's comforting to think that I could, even for myself, I would like to think, of course, that, with all of my experience, with all of my expertise, with all of my training, that I would be able to recognize if somebody is going to be an offender or to perpetrate against my child. But I know that I can't, and that's terrifying because they're not identifiable. It's not like people walk around with P's on their forehead or some kind of thing that indicates that they're different from others. They just look like anyone else, people who offend, people who abuse, people who assault. And so, yeah.
Well, and I have to throw in there, because I think it's a really important point that is not talked about. If a person is an offender, it's not like they don't know. Like, I know myself, I know who I am. So if someone's an offender and they like to molest children, or they tend to, sexually assault people from time to time, they know this about themselves. So let's be perfectly clear. If someone is an offender, they are working even harder to fit in and to be liked. They're creating a persona for themselves such that no one would ever assume, so that they can keep offending.
Yeah.
This is intentional behavior. I'm calling it out. This is intentional behavior.
Well, then we all.
Do you remember a long time ago? So it's been like 10 years ago. I remember attending this. It was a session, and it was a psychologist who specifically studied offenders. And so he went into the jails and like studied offenders who had been convicted of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And I remember he had did some research and had asked them, what would be the top 3 professions that they would choose. And I'm pretty sure that it was like police officer, teacher, and
School bus driver.
Yeah. And it's important to know this because, again, it's not just that someone, I don't think people really consider this. The soccer coach who molests the soccer team members chose that particular profession so that he would have access to children. And so it's all very intentional behavior. And so that's why it's hard for us to see it. It's hard for us to pick these folks out because they know who they are, and they have a vested interest in really hiding that aspect of their personality.
And the number of times I've heard that, oh, this person is kind, he was caring, she's well respected, people like this person, favorite teacher, that I just hear over and over again. The guy who's the best friend, who offers to drive his drunk friend home and make sure she gets home safe, okay, and everyone who was on their tippy toes about strangers is relieved because she's getting home safe, and he's the one that assaults. And I don't say that. I'm not about creating fear. I don't think fear is helpful. So I don't say that to make people scared or more scared than they are. But it's important that we have an awareness about this, because when people are abused or assaulted by the unexpected people, the people that they never saw it coming from, it's just that much more confusing. It's that much more upsetting. It can make it harder for us to believe people when they come forward and say, this teacher abused me. It can make it hard for us to wrap our head around, and yet we know that that's usually the case. It's almost always known. Usually people are surprised. It's not the person that they thought it was, that it would be.
Yeah. And again, it's because normal, healthy people, you just can't imagine that someone would do something like that. And I think that's why whenever these types of issues come out in the media, we're always looking for some sort of psychological diagnosis or some sort of thing that's wrong with their brains, because we just can't comprehend it. And even though I've worked in this area myself, I still have a really hard time comprehending it. Are you kidding me? The things that people do, they can be so terrible. And I think that the important thing is to have an awareness of what it is and what it really looks like. And I think that's why awareness work is so important. And my hope for this episode is that those who need to hear it will, and, take from it what you will.
Often when I hear discussions in the media about sexual assault or responses to, if someone's come forward, for example, if it's well-known figure or something like that, and I start hearing reports or allegations of sexual abuse or sexual assault, and I'm thinking, yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, that's pretty consistent with how I hear people talk about sexual abuse or sexual assault. Yep. And yet I hear and see and read and have conversations with people that just buy into all of these myths. Well, if it was really sexual assault, she would have reported it to the police sooner. Well, no, most people don't report to the police, and that whole process is really difficult and really challenging for a lot of different reasons. Yeah, but if she didn't want it to happen, she shouldn't have had those drinks. Well, no, that's not the way it works. And I just wish I could take my brain and take all of these experiences and stories and, all these little bits that I have from over the years and put it in this other person's brain, because I feel like, if you had all these bits of knowledge that I had, there's no way that you would ever make these insensitive statements that you do. But I think it's just hard. It is hard maybe for some people to wrap their heads around without, if you haven't heard story after story after story, survivor story, one after the other, then you don't have a sense of just how incredibly common it is for the nice, and I'm quote, you can't see me, but I'm putting in quotations, nice guy to be the rapist. You don't know how common it is for people to say, well, I didn't tell anyone because I didn't think that I'd be believed because my offender was well liked in the community. I didn't tell anyone because I wanted special attention from my offender on some level, because I liked getting gifts. I liked being tickled, and I liked playing special games. It does not excuse or make abuse okay. Because these things are not permission to be abused. They're not consent. Yeah.
Well, and I think that when it comes to, the myths and the prevailing beliefs about sexual assault, it's not just certain people that believe them. It is basically everybody, because it's kind of a cultural thing. And so that includes survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse who
Absolutely. And
internalize those messages about their own abuse. And that's part of the reason why it's important to actually discuss these things, is to try to at least address the feelings of guilt and shame, because all of these things that we've talked about, whether it's the definitions and what it is, regarding who's involved and if they're in a position of power, trust, or if you feel that you were somehow to blame because of how you acted or didn't act, or what you wore, or what you did, or whatever it was, then all of those things make your recovery, I guess, more complicated. And it kind of, if there was no guilt and blame and shame, then it would be easier to actually heal from what happened.
And I would say that every person that I've spoken to that has experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault, at least on some level or to some extent, blames themselves for what happened. They feel, I would say, shame is the most common experience for people who've experienced abuse and assault. And it is linked absolutely to these myths that we hold, these ideas about abuse and assault, ideas about what it means to be a good man or a good woman or a good child. They're just so linked, and so it's so important. What I would want for your listeners, just in considering this conversation, for listeners that haven't experienced abuse or assault, when thinking about these myths and these ideas that we're discussing, what I would hope for them is to just kind of open themselves to consider the ideas. And, if you buy into some of them, if you believe some of them a lot or a little, that's okay. They're super, super commonly held ideas. But be open to thinking about them differently, and be open to thinking about what Lisa and I are talking about, what you and I are talking about, and what we're saying that kind of challenges them. And be open to thinking about how holding these beliefs might or does impact survivors of abuse. And if you have experienced abuse, if you have been sexually assaulted, if you have been sexually abused, just know that these are absolute myths. They're not true. They might be commonly held, but they're myths, and no one is responsible for what happens to them in terms of abuse or assault. The only person that's responsible is the offender. The only person that's responsible are perpetrators of abuse. Nobody is responsible in any way for abuse that they experience themselves. Regardless, there's nothing that you can tell me. There's nothing that anyone has ever told me that has made me stop and go, oh, well, maybe you are a little bit responsible there. No, you're not responsible. Everybody, every single person deserves to go through this world without being abused or without being assaulted. I don't care the specifics from there. I don't care what your job is. I don't care what you said. I don't care what you look like. You do not deserve to be assaulted. It is never anyone's fault.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's beautifully stated. And I think that to put it into context, had you been in that situation with a different person, you wouldn't have been assaulted. Just straight up.
Exactly.
So, I mean, if you find yourself actually going through that blame cycle, think to yourself, had I been, let's say, for example, you're in a relationship now and you know, with a safe partner who treats you appropriately and would never abuse you. What if it had been your partner in that same situation? What would have happened? That could make it clearer that it wasn't something that you did. And I think that's really important. And so, you know, Erin, we've gone through so much today. And I know, because we used to work together, that we could talk for so long because this topic is so broad and there's always just so much to talk about. So, Erin, if you actually, or I could wave a magic wand and change one common myth or idea about sexual assault, what would it be?
For me, it would be this idea that when people experience sexual assault or sexual abuse, that they're somewhat responsible for what happened. And I think I kind of already said it, actually.
Yeah.
Like, just in that's really, that little last rant I went on is what I would change. I would change that the myth, the belief that people are responsible when they experience sexual abuse or sexual assault, the belief that something that a person does, or a way that a person dresses, the way that a person speaks or acts, something inherently about that person, maybe their ethnicity or their social class or their job, that there are things that people do or things that are inherent to a person that somehow permits or allows sexual assault or sexual abuse. I would absolutely change that. I think there's so much blame, self-blame, and shame that just kind of burrows its way in to survivors of sexual abuse and sexual assault, and that can make it so difficult, so tough to let go and move forward and to thrive and to feel happy and healthy. And I think that it's just so linked to those myths that are related to that responsibility. And so if I could, I would wave that wand and just take away this idea that anyone ever is responsible for abuse or assault that they experience, because they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I wish I could erase that as well. It'd be lovely. Maybe
Yeah.
we will one day, or at least make a significant impact and a dent, especially with the work that you're doing in your PhD. So I can't wait to hear more about that.
Thank you. It's been lovely talking with you about this today. I know that it's not everyone would say that they'd had a wonderful evening talking about sexual assault, but I get worked up about these kinds of things, and it's nice to feel as though I'm doing something about it.
Yeah, well, you know, at this point in my recording, the podcast has been downloaded 16,000 times.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. And
That's
so
crazy. I can't even wrap my head around that.
I
That's
know,
crazy.
right? And so hopefully what we're doing here at least helps a bit. So in part 2 coming up on Friday, Erica and I really talk about more specifically the impact that sexual assault and sexual abuse has on fertility in particular, and how it can play a role in your relationship, how it can play a role, as we had mentioned, when it comes to children, getting pregnant, and also how it can play a role in the process if a person's also struggling with infertility. And so, I mean, as I mentioned, the purpose of this episode was to really set the foundation. And then the purpose of the second episode is to really delve into how this history of sexual assault and sexual abuse can impact fertility in general. Mm-hmm. Well, Erin, thank you so much for being here today. I had an awesome time chatting with you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You can find me on Twitter at Fertile Friday, or stop by the blog and leave a comment in the show notes for today's episode, which you'll find at www.fertilityfriday.com/Erin. And you can also find me on the Fertility Friday Facebook fan page, which is facebook.com/fertilityfridays with an S. And you can also head over to the Fertility Friday Facebook group, which is at fertilityfriday.com/community. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, please look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. Make sure to tune in to part 2 of this 2-part series if you enjoyed the first part. As I mentioned earlier, part 2 is specifically related to the impact of sexual abuse and sexual assault on infertility. And this episode was more focused on the background of sexual assault. So thanks again for listening. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.